Hey, seventh grade. You guys hear the joke about the dyslexic devil worshiper? He sold his soul to Santa. That one was good. Okay, we have chapter 5, 1 John to do today. And remember, when we're studying John doesn't organize things in a linear way. He doesn't go point by point. He just kind of like wanders around from point to point. So it's not exactly the most organized letter that he's written, but he's got a lot of good things to say. So chapter 5, he's going to talk about a variety of things. He's going to talk about divine filiation and its relation to caritas. He's going to talk about the symbolism of blood and water and how that contradicts the Cerinthian heresy. He's going to talk about being a witness to Christ, right? And then finally, he's going to give advice on some prayer. So that's basically the outline of chapter 5. Okay, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is a child of God, and everyone who loves the parent loves the child. By this, we know that when we love the children of God, we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. Right? So he's saying if you love God, that means you have to love all of God's children. And remember, Christians, by divine filiation, are adopted children of God. So therefore, in order to express caritas, you have to recognize the reality of divine filiation. You cannot separate the two. Right? You can't say that someone is a child of God, but then refuse to love them. Even if they're your enemies, you still have to love them because they are children of God. The only way to love God on earth, remember, is to love his creation, to love other human beings who are created in his image and likeness, especially if they are baptized. All right. And then how do we love God specifically with regards to other people? By keeping God's commandments. Right? And how do we have the power to keep his commandments in the face of temptation? Well, because through divine filiation, we possess the grace necessary to keep the commandments, right? When you receive baptism, when you receive the other sacraments, you receive grace from God because of divine filiation that gives you the power to actually keep God's commandments even in the face of temptation. Right? So caritas, divine filiation, they go together. All right. Now we're going to talk about water and blood. This is he who came by water and by blood, Jesus Christ, not with the water only, but with the water and the blood. So water and blood are symbols here. Right? Water is used to symbolize baptism. And specifically when John using it here, he's saying that Jesus came by water. Right? He's referring to Jesus' earthly baptism by John the Baptist. Right? So water would represent baptism, Christ's earthly baptism, and also Christ's divine nature. But John doesn't just say Jesus came by water, he also says he came by blood. Right? What does blood symbolize? Well, blood symbolizes the Eucharist because we have the precious blood as part of the Eucharist. But of course, it also symbolizes Christ's death. Right? So if water symbolizes Christ's baptism and is therefore a symbol of his divine nature, and blood symbolizes death, that means blood would also be a symbol of his human nature. Can you see where this is going with regards to the Cerinthians? Because blood and water are both the means by which Jesus arrives, according to John, blood and water cannot be separated from one another. And this is true when Jesus is on the cross. Remember when Christ's side is pierced by the spear? What happens is when Jesus is on the cross, a lot of people are confused because the wound is on the right side, right? But the heart is on the left side. Well, what happened when the soldier pierced Jesus, like the heart's up here, you can't really see in this video. So the heart's here, the pierce mark is here. What happens is the spear went through Jesus' ribs, went all the way across, and then it went to the heart. When you're crucified, what happens is there's a sac around your heart that fills up like a water balloon with water and blood. And this is because of the beatings and the asphyxiation that occurs during a crucifixion, right? It's kind of a combination of being asphyxiated to death plus bleeding to death at the same time. So the heart becomes very, very stressed, and it takes on a lot of water and blood in order to keep the body alive. Well, what happens is the water and the blood fill up this sac around the heart. It's called the cardiac sac, I think. And it's like a water balloon. Well, when the soldier pierced Jesus' side, the spear went all the way through his ribs to the other side, and it punctured the heart. And that water balloon full of water and blood burst. All right? And that's why all the water and blood gushed out of Jesus' side at once. Right? So the water and the blood, Jesus' divine nature and his human nature are united, right? And the fact that they are still united after Jesus' death is John's way of sort of sticking it to the Corinthians, who, remember, believe that Jesus' divine nature is Christ, which left his human nature when he was crucified. And John is saying, nope, the water and the blood are together even after Jesus is dead. This is how we can know for sure that Jesus' divine nature and human nature are permanently united ever since the incarnation. All right? By the way, this image here is the Divine Mercy image. I'm sure you guys have seen it before. It's in our church at Our Lady of Lourdes. You see these on prayer cards all the time. There's a devotion called the Divine Mercy devotion. This was an image that was painted based on a vision by a famous Catholic saint called Saint Faustina, right? And she had this vision of Jesus, and in one of her visions, Jesus told her to have his image painted like this. And this is supposedly a very exact representation of what she saw in her vision, like down to the smallest little detail. It's supposed to be a very, very exact depiction of her vision. Well, what's happening in the vision here is there's red light and blue light shining from Jesus' heart. Right? And as we read in John here, the red, which we would associate with blood, and the blue, which we would associate with water, are symbols of the unity of Jesus' human nature and his divine nature. They are together, and they are stored up in his sacred heart. Right? So when St. Faustina saw this image, and Jesus told her to have it painted exactly, the artist did so in a way that shows that the divine nature and human nature of Christ remain intact. They remain together in the Sacred Heart. All right. There are three witnesses: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. So we have water and blood together again, this time combined with the Spirit. If we receive the testimony of men, the testimony of God is greater. He who does not believe God has made him a liar. Okay, so in the ancient world, if you wanted to make a claim against somebody in court, if you wanted to present witness testimony in court, the laws said that you had to have multiple witnesses to support your claim, right? So if, for example, Stephen wants to claim that Ethan stole something out of his backpack, right? In order to make a claim like that in a Jewish court, Stephen would have to have multiple witnesses to back him up. He couldn't just go to Vanessa and Riley and and say that's it. He would also need like at least one more witness, maybe Jerry, to testify that he saw Ethan steal whatever it is out of Stephen's backpack. Right? You have to have multiple witnesses. So John is using three witnesses here to communicate the gospel. He's saying we have three witnesses: the water, the blood, and the Spirit. All right? So what are the water and the blood? Well, we just talked about that. By referring to them here, though, John is also talking about the baptism and death of Jesus, which are part of his divine life. They're not the endpoints of his divinity, like the Cerinthians claimed. Right? Remember, Cerinthians believe that Jesus and Christ were separate and then became unified at his baptism and then separated again at his crucifixion. Then John is going farther and he's saying another reason we know this is true is because it's the testimony of God himself. God the Father himself is a witness to the divinity of Jesus Christ, the unity of the divine and human. Right? And God the Father is the ultimate witness. So if you reject the teachings of the church on this, if you're a Cerinthian, you are rejecting the testimony of God and therefore making God a liar. But John just doesn't stop there. He also extends it to anyone who denies the divinity of Jesus. These would be the pagans, the Jews, and any heretic as well. He's saying you are calling God a liar. All right, last slide. And this is the confidence which we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. We have obtained the requests made of him. So here John is ending his letter by giving advice to Christians. He's talking about the importance of being confident when you pray. God wants us to pray confidently to him. And he says, we can be confident in our prayers if we ask anything according to his will. So what does this mean? This means either that you have to ask for what God wants you to ask, or be how God wants you to be when you ask for something, right? John is not saying that you should ask God for a new Xbox. That's not what he's saying here, right? Because God might not want you to ask for an Xbox. It might not be good for you to have an Xbox. Or I don't know what video game systems you guys have now. Xboxes are still a thing, right? Whatever. So John is saying, if you ask what God desires you to ask, or you are how God desires you to be when you ask for something, your prayer will be granted. Okay? He's not saying God's like a genie who's going to grant a wish. You actually have to fulfill these conditions for the prayer to be granted. So if these conditions are met, God will grant your prayer. Because if you're meeting one of these conditions, by definition, you're not going to pray for anything that doesn't accord with God's will. In contrast to this, the devil wants prayer to be shaky, weak, or non-existent. He wants you to pray in a way that is not confident. Right? So he tempts you to believe that God is not going to grant your prayer. Or he tempts you to pray for things. If he can't stop you from praying, then he'll tempt you to pray for something that God doesn't want for you. Right? It's not a sin to pray for something that God doesn't want for you, but it would be a sin to try to treat God like a genie who's going to grant all your wishes. All right, that is it for 1 John. Hooray!